This Australian man seems like your average redneck, or average bogan in this instance. However, what should have been the standard kangaroo hunting and backyard barbecues quickly turned into human experimenting and mass homicides, perpetrated by the infamous Aussie man, Ivan Milat. I'm sure that most of us can agree that taking a quiet backpacking trip through the forest or up into the mountains sounds like a great time outdoors, a quiet getaway that almost anyone would enjoy. But what if you knew that there was a vicious killer on the loose who may have been hiding out in the very woods you were backpacking through? The case of Ivan Milat is truly disturbing, as Ivan preyed on unsuspecting victims who were hitchhiking along the Hume Highway in New South Wales. After picking up hitchhikers, Ivan would take them to a secluded forest and claim their lives. Today's truly chilling story will take us deep into the mind of Ivan Milat, giving us a better understanding of what led this monster to become such a savage criminal. As always, welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name's James, and today this is the case of Ivan Milat. Ivan Milat was born in December of 1944. His father, Ivan Milat, was a Croatian immigrant who had moved to Australia in the early 1900s. His mother, Margaret, was about 18 years younger than his father, and the two got married when she was only 16 years old. In total, the two would have 14 children together, with Ivan being the fifth child. When the family was still growing, they set up a modest home in Bosley. However, they quickly outgrew this home and moved to Liverpool. In total, 10 of the Milat children were boys and only 4 were girls. It seems like the 4 girls were very well behaved, but the 10 boys were always getting into trouble. According to locals, police were very familiar with the Milat family, strictly because the boys couldn't seem to stay in line. Cops were always being called to the home or nearby areas because the boys were always up to no good and their parents couldn't seem to keep up with all 10 of them. Ivan is said to have had a difficult time as a child and had begun to pull away from his family and friends before he was a teenager. Professionals dub this as antisocial behavior, but inside of Ivan, something was building that he couldn't seem to control. By the time Ivan was in his late teen years, he had begun to have numerous run-ins with the law. Most of the time, these incidents were very minor, and he was simply asked to go home to his parents. However, by the time Ivan was 17, he had been sentenced to a juvenile center after he was caught stealing. After he was released, he was arrested once again within 2 years, after he was involved in breaking into a local business. You'd think this would have been enough to keep Ivan in line, but his crime spree was only just beginning. By 1964, he had been arrested yet again and was sentenced to 18 months in prison for breaking and entering. When he was released from prison, he was picked up by officers yet again after he was found driving a stolen car. This time, the court wasn't lenient with him. Rather than just locking him up, they decided it was time to take things a step further, agreeing to sentence him to 2 years of hard labor. Surely this would teach him a lesson and keep him civil after his release, right? Well, not exactly. By 1971, Ivan was arrested once again. This time he was apprehended after police found out that he had been involved with various robberies in the area, as well as multiple kidnapping cases. The details of these cases are quite disturbing, as the courts claim that Ivan was suspected of abducting 2 18-year-old hitchhikers. 2 young ladies say that he essayed one of them. However, Ivan managed to get away with the crimes with the help of his lawyer. During his time at trial, Ivan is said to have faked his own death and fled to New Zealand for a while before being arrested once again. Finally, after getting away with such savage crimes, Ivan picked up his first real job and began working as a truck driver in 1975, maintaining this job for about 20 years. With a criminal history like this from his teenage years and early 20s, you'd think Ivan was clearly a ticking time bomb, but he actually remained clear from breaking the law for the next 15 years. By the winter of 1989, Belanglo State Forest began to witness a disproportionate number of missing persons cases. This area was normally a quiet and serene environment where Australian locals could get away from the hustle and bustle of the city life and unwind for a bit. However, over the course of a couple of years, the area would be turned into a hotspot for missing people. The first people to go missing were a couple from Frankston. Deborah Everest and James Gibson had just begun their adult lives, both being 19 years old. The two had just left Sydney, heading for Confest near Albury. However, somewhere along their journey, the two disappeared and were never heard from again. Police didn't think too much of their disappearance at first, and after a brief investigation, the case was shelved due to a lack of evidence and information. January of 1991 would see yet another missing persons case opened in the area. A 21-year-old woman from Germany named Simone Schmidl was leaving Sydney and headed toward Melbourne when she lost contact with her loved ones and was never heard from again. In a strikingly similar case, two more visitors from Germany would go missing as well. Gabor Neubauer and Anja Hadschid, aged 21 and 20, disappeared after they left a hostel on December 26, 1991. Finally, disaster would strike again just a few months later in 1992. Two backpackers from Britain were traveling through the area. Caroline Clark, aged 21, and Joanne Walters, aged 22, were last seen near King's Cross on April 18, 1992. They both went missing under suspicious circumstances and were never heard from again. By September of 1992, news of the missing people had spread throughout the local community, but police still had no idea what could have happened to these individuals. They had no evidence that pointed toward foul play, but it seems as though all of these people had just vanished off the face of the earth. Though they would soon learn that the truth was much worse than they could have imagined. Two runners were exercising near Belanglo Forest when they stumbled across a body that had been crudely concealed from passers-by. They had no idea what could have happened here, so they contacted police and officers arrived within minutes. Police almost immediately knew that this must have been a homicide investigation, and they began searching the surrounding area for clues. It didn't take them long to stumble across another body located about 100 feet from the first body. 45-year-old Ivan Milat was supposedly just driving his truck at the time, delivering goods to local businesses around town. The alleged rehabilitated man was just playing his part for the community, not one to be a suspect in a serial killer case. Officers removed both bodies from the crime scene and began doing their best to determine the identities of the two. In a relatively short period of time, they used dental records to determine that the bodies belonged to Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. Police went back to the scene of the crime with a search team and conducted a very thorough investigation of the surrounding areas. They hadn't found any more clues or evidence pointing toward additional joggers being buried in the woods. With this, they packed up and headed back to the office, hoping to uncover the answers at a later time. As it would turn out, they would get their wish in October of 1993. A man had been searching through the woods for firewood when he came across a set of bones. After realizing what he had just discovered, officers were called to the woods and the man led them to an area where he had found the bones. When police began to search the area, they found the remains of two people buried within close proximity to one another. They soon realized that these were the remains of Deborah Everest and James Gibson, the first couple who had been reported missing near the forest. What made this discovery a bit strange is that officers previously mentioned that they had found Gibson's camera and backpack near Galston Gorge. This was more than 120 kilometers north of where his body was eventually found. Just a few weeks later, in November of 1993, police would find yet another skeleton that had been left behind in the woods. This time, the body was found along a trail during a police sweep of the woods. Officers removed the body from the woods and took it for further testing, quickly realizing that it belonged to 21-year-old Simone Schmidl. Investigators continued on with their search, and just 3 days later, they had found yet another body. This time, they located the remains of Anja Habscheid. A short while later, the remains of Gabor Neugbauer were found as well, though many of his clothing items were said to have been found near Simone's body. No one knows why. Each of the bodies had been buried in shallow graves. By this point, police knew that they had a serial killer, or killers, on their hands. As officers further examined the bodies that they had found of these innocent backpackers, they began to realize something that was incredibly disturbing and unlike anything they had assumed before. Not only had these people lost their lives at the hands of a savage criminal, but most of them had been brutally tortured before they passed away. We won't get into the gruesome details of what happened to some of these people, but it became painfully clear to the officers that this was not the work of your average serial killer. The person who did this clearly had some major issues and seemed to find joy in the pain and agony of other people. As a result of this realization, the local police department set up a task force AIR, a team of more than 20 detectives, to dedicate all of their time to the case to try to find out who could have been responsible for such horrible crimes. At this same time, they set up a tip line in which locals could call police directly with any new information that may help out in the investigation. Hundreds of tips came pouring in, leading officers to come up with a list of around 230 people who could have committed the crime. As tips continued to flood in and more information was coming to light, they were able to narrow down this list to just 32 people, giving them a much clearer image of who their killer may be. Though around this time, police began to suspect that the crimes could have been committed by a team of killers, rather than just one person. They came to this assumption because many of the victims passed away in pairs. This would have been very difficult for one person to pull off, unless he had meticulously planned his course of action. Officers would finally get their first major break in the case when they received a phone call from Paul, a 24-year-old man. He was from the UK and had been backpacking in Australia in 1990. He told officers that while heading toward Mildura from Liverpool Station, he hitched a ride with a man who only called himself Bill. Paul explained that while the two were driving, the tone of the drive began to change when the two were just 1 kilometer away from Belanglo State Forest. It was at this point that Bill pulled a firearm out and pointed it at Paul. We don't know the exact circumstances of what took place next, but we do know that Paul managed to break away from Bill and flag down a nearby car. The driver picked up Paul and fled the scene, paying close attention to Bill as he drove by. The two made it out unscathed, but their experience would help to blow this case wide open just 3 years later. Paul gave his official statement to the police. The driver who picked him up, Joanne Barry, also gave a very similar statement to officers. With these two police reports on file, police now had a clear description of the man who committed these crimes. They used this information to narrow down their pool of suspects even more, quickly realizing that their main suspect was Ivan Milat. By February of 1994, police were hot on the heels of Milat. As they continued to dig into Milat's past, they found out that he had sold the vehicle he used to transport the bodies just days after it was revealed that police had found the bodies of all the missing hitchhikers. After this, they began looking into his work history and found out that he had been off work on the days that each of these backpackers went missing. To add to this, his co-workers and friends also explained that Milat had an eerie obsession with weapons and firearms, making him the perfect suspect of the crimes. Paul Onions decided to fly to Australia to help police with the case. After Ivan Milat had been taken into police custody, Paul helped them out by positively identifying Ivan as the man who had threatened him just 4 years earlier. Ivan was officially charged on May 22, 1994. While searching his home, officers found several weapons that would have been used in the crimes, as well as personal items that belonged to several of the victims. When Ivan was taken to court, he refused to enter a plea. He also fired his original attorney and hired a new one. His brothers were soon charged with illegal possession of weapons, but police don't know whether or not his brothers were involved in the killings. During Ivan's trial, more than 200 witnesses came forward and testified against him, giving first-hand accounts of what they had seen and helped paint a very disturbing picture of the man that Ivan had become. By July of 1996, a jury finally found Ivan Milat guilty of all 7 murders. On top of this, they also convicted him of the attempted murder of Paul Onions. He was given a life sentence for every life he took and was given an additional 6 years for what he did to Paul Onions. On the first day that Ivan arrived in prison, he was beaten very badly by a fellow inmate. A year later, Milat tried to escape prison, but his plan failed. He was then transferred to a maximum security prison. This is normally the part of the story where the bad guy rots in jail for the rest of his life, and that's definitely what happened, but not without a few more twists and turns. In January of 2009, Ivan cut off his own finger with a plastic knife and planned on mailing it to the High Court of Australia, hoping to force their hand and grant him an appeal. This would never happen, but he was taken to the hospital where doctors told him that there was no way to reattach his finger and that he would have to live with what he had done. By 2011, Ivan went on a 9-day hunger strike, hoping to convince guards into giving him a PlayStation in his cell. This was after there was a ton of public outcry after people found out that he had both a toaster and a television in his cell. His requests for the PlayStation were denied. 8 years later, in 2019, Ivan Milat passed away from cancer at the age of 74. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Ivan Milat. And why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.